Hey everyone, just a quick little unscripted bit before the actual video starts. I just wanted to say that this video is a celebration of March Caprice, an event put on by a couple of people in the Kingdom Hearts community to celebrate the existence of the whole franchise by getting together a bunch of creators just to kind of really give it the love that it deserves. This video, for me, is a collection of months of planning, so I really hope you like it. I don't know how it's gonna turn out. This is the first thing I've ever made, but, I really hope it turns out well. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you have a great March Caprice. So, with that out of the way, let's just get on to the video.
And now, our feature presentation.
Characters are a pivotal part of any story. That much is obvious. I mean, could you imagine The Lord of the Rings without any characters? It'd just be the ring. Although just having characters alone isn't enough to create a great story that can invest people, and this is where character development comes into play. If you've ever read a book, watched a movie, or really absorbed any piece of media ever, you'll know this. And you'll also know that sometimes it's done better than other times. I know all of this is very obvious, but it's how I decided to start my script because it'll help get the point of the video across later. Some of the best characters and developments to have ever graced our little tiny entertainment-driven brains come from the Final Fantasy series. With characters and stories ranging from simple to incredibly complex, Final Fantasy has it all. Cloud Strife, Celeste from Final Fantasy VI, and Vivi from Final Fantasy IX are all some of the best characters to be created, with some of the most interesting, emotional, and driving stories shown in not only video games, but in media as a whole. Now, wouldn't it be wacky if some of these aforementioned geniusly written characters were taken out of their stories and slapped into a game that focuses on a 14-year-old kid with a giant key running around with his friends, a dog and a duck, trying to kill the physical embodiment of darkness? Yeah, what if? Well, guess what, baby? It fucking happened. Exploring how the Final Fantasy characters were integrated into not only the worlds, but also the overall themes and story in the Kingdom Hearts games has always been something I've wanted to do. I mean, this is the series where Donald the Duck of Disney fame famously shouts, "Sora and Sephiroth!" And none of us blink an eye because that's just standard Kingdom Hearts bizarreness. With so many games involved in this series, most of which have some bit of Final Fantasy content, this video will be organized by characters in order of appearance, starting with Kingdom Hearts 1, ending with Kingdom Hearts 3 Remind. There are a lot of characters and a lot of story to cover here, so I'm just gonna start now. Right off the bat, when starting Kingdom Hearts 1, you're introduced to Sora's quote-unquote best friends, besides Riku and Kairi on the Destiny Islands. These characters being Tidus, who will from this point forward be referred to as Tidus, because that is how it is correctly pronounced, and Wakka, who are both lifted from Final Fantasy X, and alongside them is Selphie from Final Fantasy VIII. The reason for Tidus and Wakka being here is honestly most likely due to the fact that Final Fantasy X was the most recent game released by Squaresoft at the time of Kingdom Hearts 1's release. Unfortunately for you, and for past me who was scripting this video well into the late hours of the night, I like to dive too deep into things because I have a problem. The story of Tidus in Final Fantasy X is one that's almost uniquely tragic, involving a boy thrown out of his world and away from all that he knows, who then makes every effort he possibly can in order to figure out what is going on and find his way back home. But along the way, discovering that the main love interest is in trouble, and after learning so, he goes the route of self-sacrifice to save her. Sound familiar? Yeah, although there are some clear differences like Tidus and Yuna's love plot on the side, he and Sora share some of the exact same story beats, down to the final self-sacrificial act performed by the hero so that the love interest can live. In Tidus's case, it was defeating sin for good instead of just sealing him away, and for Sora, it was violently stabbing himself in his own heart. Tidus was most likely placed here as one of the first characters we can interact with because of his similarities with Sora in their individual stories. Or Square just wanted to push their latest Final Fantasy game on all the childrens who saw shiny J-pop in Disney and begged their parents to buy them
Kingdom Hearts to PlayStation 2, rated E for everyone, please. Yes.
Waka? Well, to be honest, he's probably just here because he's an islander and fit the Destiny Islands aesthetic. If I had to draw a connection, it would be that Waka's substitution of his brother with Tidus is a parallel to Sora's replacement of Riku with Donald and Goofy. But honestly, that's a bit of a stretch and I don't know if I could believe it. Selphie, on the other hand, is a very interesting choice for placement on the Destiny Islands, and even more so as a friend at the beginning of the game. Now, Selphie, in case you didn't know, comes from Final Fantasy VIII, a game that I actually got to play for the first time while researching for this video. And her role is the quirky, annoying girl with a heart of gold that you should hate but can't help but love. And she pretty much hits that exact same mark in Kingdom Hearts. Minus the heart of gold and the love, because along with Tidus and Waka, she exists for a grand total of about 15 minutes in the series. Her character path throughout the first half of Final Fantasy VIII and the way it relates to her role in Kingdom Hearts, however, is actually something that deserves to be discussed. In that game, Selphie is an exchange student coming from a partnering school and takes up residence at Balam Garden, quickly becoming acquainted with Squall.
That's Leon.
But we'll talk about him later. Later, without spoiling too much, she becomes concerned about her original home and basically derails an entire military world-saving mission to make sure it's okay. This is in some ways quite similar to Kairi, who in the first game had such a strong desire to find her original home that she was pretty much the entire reason that she, Sora, and Riku were going out on that raft in the first place. As a thought, after writing this bit, I decided to look at one more thing involving Tidus, Waka, and Selphie, the choices that they make Sora choose during his dive to the heart. Tidus asks, "What are you so afraid of?" Waka asks, "What do you want out of life?" And Selphie asks, "What's most important to you?" The questions that each of them ask does in some way relate to their own stories from their respective game. Tidus' story is about overcoming his fear of not living up to his father, and he eventually faces those fears when he sacrifices his own life, conquering his fears and insecurities to save Yuna. Waka's story is about how to move on with his own life after the loss of his brother, something that he tries to fill for pretty much the entire game with Tidus, but again realizes that he has to live his life moving forward, not stuck in the past. Even Selphie, her arc is about choosing what's more important, her friend's safety or her home. The questions are parallels to the characters' own struggles in their games, and I think that's a pretty neat connection for someone to make while scripting at 6 AM after having been awake for a very long time. I'd say that, as a whole, Destiny Islands is pretty okay in terms of character story integration. You have here a good high point with Tidus' parallels to Sora, and although that isn't expanded on whatsoever at any point in the series, seriously, he never shows up again ever except for one moment at the end of Chain of Memories, it's still pretty neat. Other points in the series, and even in Kingdom Hearts 1, will definitely do it better than it was done here, but it was still a pretty good point to start on. Moving on from the Destiny Islands after a very small apocalypse, Sora arrives in Traverse Town, which is under the management of 3 Final Fantasy characters, and Sid. He gets a better job later in the games, but for now that's pretty much the extent of what he's doing here. The other 3 characters that have significantly more of an impact on the actual story than Sid does are Leon, Yuffie, and Aerith. Now Leon, aside from being the reason that most people back in 2002 actually bought the video game, Leon also has one of the largest influences on the story of any non-main character. He's the one that taught Sora what the Keyblade is, and how to fight with it, and for all intents and purposes, Leon is Sora's mentor in the first game, despite not actually having all that much screen time. This is a trait that calls back to Final Fantasy VIII, as Squall was effectively made headmaster of his school and leader of an entire military force as a 17-year-old boy. Leon is just about the greatest leader that you could ask for from the Final Fantasy series, so choosing him for this role doesn't only pander to audiences that played and fell in love with Squall 3 years prior, but it also calls upon the source material in a fantastic way by making him the leader of a resistance against an evil witch that uses darkness powers. In his appearance in Chain of Memories, Leon and the rest of the Traverse troupe forget who Sora is because of some Castle Oblivion magic or something, and this is particularly cool because one of the main themes of Final Fantasy VIII is dealing with memory loss and remembering those who are most important to you. In this case, Leon forgetting who Sora is despite their exploits is a pretty damn direct reference to that. Unfortunately, it would likely go over the head of anyone who has not played Final Fantasy VIII. Finally, in Kingdom Hearts 2 and the Remind DLC of Kingdom Hearts 3, Leon is acting as the head of the Hollow Bastion/Radiant Garden Restoration Committee. As the canonical home of all Final Fantasy characters in Kingdom Hearts, he feels responsible to ensure it's restored to its former glory. As a quick aside, I firmly believe that Selphie should have been included in this committee, as she was the head of the Balam Garden Festival Committee and cared deeply when it came to making the school the best that it could be. But you know, that's just my opinion, so I guess it doesn't really matter too much. Here are some fun facts about Rebranded Squall that I couldn't naturally fit into the script. When you fight Leon in the Olympus Coliseum, after reducing his HP to less than half, he will go into Limit Break mode, the activation animation for which is identical to his Blasting Zone Limit Break in Final Fantasy VIII. After having activated Limit Break mode, Leon will then use two attacks called Rough Divide and Fated Circle. His level 1 and level 2 limit breaks respectively. During these attacks, he does not stun, and in true Final Fantasy VIII fashion, he'll keep spamming them over and over until you are dead. Yuffie, the bubbly personality of Traverse Town and Radiant Garden, the one that has been memed on since 2002, and the one character out of these three that is probably the oddest choice to have as part of the Restoration Committee, since she was a completely missable character in a little 1997 game that nobody played called Final Fantasy VII. Her characterization in the original Final Fantasy VII was good, but I honestly think it was improved upon in this game, which then led to the masterpiece that is the Final Fantasy VII Remake Yuffie. Originally, Yuffie was given very little development aside from one side quest in which she learned that stealing is bad. Aside from that, she's also shown to be snarky, somewhat shy, but still holds her honor high. In other words, she's pretty much the tsundere of Final Fantasy VII. In the Kingdom Hearts games, they keep her energy the same, but give her more characterization, adding to the little that she had in the original, and because of that, you get a characterization that relates to and expands upon her appearance in Final Fantasy VII. Yuffie is one of the few to join Leon as a member of the Restoration Committee, showing her devotion to her home, which was always a big part of her character since she stole Cloud & Co.'s materia to restore her home in Wutai. And they also made her feel more like what she is supposed to be, a kid dealing with adult responsibilities. I bet you didn't know that Yuffie is only 16, making her substantially younger than the rest of the party in Final Fantasy VII, and the second youngest Final Fantasy character found in Kingdom Hearts. Needless to say, her character is pretty perfectly incorporated into the story of Kingdom Hearts, and gives a great expansion on a character who, at the time of release, had had the bare minimum story surrounding her. Aerith, on the other hand...
Oh my god!
Aerith had the character, the story, and the potential to be an amazing character in Kingdom Hearts. She just wasn't used in such a way that would allow her to shine. Aerith's story is one that pretty much everyone who's ever breathed in the general direction of a Square Enix game is familiar with. She's an ancient who's trying to help Cloud & Co. stop Sephiroth from reaching the Promised Land and destroying the world in the process. Then she, major spoilers for Final Fantasy VII if you haven't played it, skip to this time to not be spoiled, dies in a self-sacrifice to give the Holy Materia a connection to the life stream, which then is the main reason the world is not destroyed by this bitch. The point of this is that this story fits so well into the themes of Kingdom Hearts that Aerith is a damn near parallel to Sora. From unexpectedly being thrown into the journey with really no reason other than having a crush on the boy who was primarily affected, all the way to the self-sacrificial way that both of them help save the world from being swallowed by darkness. It is strongly my belief that Aerith was completely mishandled in the story of Kingdom Hearts, especially in Kingdom Hearts 2, where she is a glorified paperweight more than anything. The most story impact that Aerith has ever had in the series is when a manifestation of her memory tells Sora that he's in Castle Oblivion, which is then promptly forgotten anyway. Aerith could have and should have had much more significance, and honestly, I'm a little mad that they didn't explore anything with her. Sorry for the short rant, but come on Square, do better. Next up on the chopping block, we have the main character of Final Fantasy VII, the one that everyone loves. The one that wields a sword way too big for his scrawny little arms to possibly carry. That's right, we're talking about... Sephiroth! And also Cloud too, I guess. I mean, I'm actually going to be discussing these two together because while they both do have scenes unrelated to each other, the vast majority of their integration in the Kingdom Hearts story comes from their rivalry with each other. Cloud and Sephiroth have one of the most legendary rivalries in all of video games, up there with Dante and Virgil, and regular Pat and Michael Mouse. So of course you can only expect that their stories in Kingdom Hearts would be linked together. In Kingdom Hearts 1, the seeds of their rivalry are only shown through Cloud briefly mentioning he's looking for someone. And this could honestly be either Tifa or Sephiroth, but it's pretty heavily implied to be Sephiroth, especially in the final mixed version of this where you get the badass scene of Cloud fighting Sephiroth after you beat him. I think it's pretty clear that the reason Cloud has been going using darkness and trusting literal Satan is because he's looking for Sephiroth. Which weirdly would make this a sequel to Advent Children, but I'm not gonna read too much into this because it hurts my brain. This plotline of the two of them looking for each other to finish this, or something, is continuous in Kingdom Hearts 2 as well, where it's ramped up to 11. Sephiroth isn't just a secret superboss anymore. Now he's a plot-relevant superboss. All of this is to say that the Cloud and Sephiroth dynamic is meant to be a tie-in with the Sora vs. Riku plot in the first game. Cloud turning to the most extreme methods to find and defeat Sephiroth is almost a glimpse to the future to what would happen should Sora not be able to help Riku. Just slap a Keyblade in Cloud's hand and the Soul Eater into Sephiroth's and you pretty much have Kingdom Hearts 1 if it took place 10 years later. And of course, in a discussion about Cloud, you can never leave out Tifa. Whether you think she's best girl waifu material, or you think she's entirely inferior to Aerith, you can't argue that Tifa is the one who constantly pushes Cloud into being himself and doing the right thing, no matter how many times he says he's not interested. This is absolutely reflected in Kingdom Hearts 2 when Tifa is actually the one searching for Cloud to help him battle his darkness. And not only does she do that, but she's the one that gives Cloud the strength to finally go back up against Sephiroth in their final scene in Kingdom Hearts 2 and the franchise. These characters are all pretty much peas in a pod, inseparable by fate, franchises, and timelines, so seeing them so well incorporated into the overall story and themes of Kingdom Hearts is something that is just such a great inclusion into the games. One last Final Fantasy VII character is included in Kingdom Hearts to round out the roster. My baby, the love of my life, and the one that never got his date with Aqua, Zack Fair. If you were like me and played Birth by Sleep for the first time and had no idea who this bozo hitting on Best Girl was, well then congratulations, you're most people. This is because Zack never got his own proper story until Crisis Core, a prequel game for Final Fantasy VII that came out years after the original game. Despite this, Zack is still technically the protagonist for a good chunk of the original Final Fantasy VII, because of some memory trauma shit that I won't go into right now because this video's already long enough. The main thing here is that Zack was Cloud's mentor and best friend, making him the best possible option to have fill the role of Cloud in a game set 10 years before Kingdom Hearts 1. Zack's personality as this bubbly, affectionate, but also dedicated dumbass was brought through pretty well for what little on-screen time he had. Over the visits to Olympus Coliseum with each of the main party members, we see Zack as he tries to prove himself as a hero against Hercules, in a very similar fashion to how he tried desperately to prove himself worthy of being a first-class soldier to Angeal and Sephiroth in his own game. While I wish there was more to say here, Zack has a very small role in the series, even compared to other characters that are coming up soon. As someone whose favorite game in the series is Birth by Sleep, I know, I'm weird, It's the moments like these that really make me feel warm and happy with the game. And although there is very limited Final Fantasy content in that game, the little that there is done exceptionally well. Although it is entirely possible to the fact that I'm just a sucker for Zack. Now that we've talked about most of the Final Fantasy characters that have been given a nice-sized part in the Kingdom Hearts series, I thought it'd be fun to have a little speed round with the characters that are left over, but that I still have things to say about. These characters mostly act as side attractions in the game with no real story significance, but it's still neat to see that they do in fact exist in universe, and it would be cool to see them given more significance in the future. So let's do this. Here we have Cypher, Raijin, and Fujin, the disciplinary committee from Final Fantasy VIII and recurring antagonists against Squall and Co. These three can be found in Twilight Town throughout Kingdom Hearts 2, mostly bullying Hayner, Pence, and Olette, as true villains do. It's implied that they're the ones that started the 7 Wonders of Twilight Town rumors to get a free summer homework assignment done. This in particular is very in line with their portrayal in the original game. They also have some fun speech patterns, as in Final Fantasy VIII. Raijin talks a lot and ends everything with "you know," and Fujin only speaks in loud, sharp, singular words. The three of them are also mentioned in Kingdom Hearts 3 by Twilight Town residents, one of the only pieces of Final Fantasy lore in that game before Remind came out. Next up is Vivi, a cute little debatably aged, canonically 9-year-old black mage acting as the only Final Fantasy IX representation in the entire Kingdom Hearts series. Vivi is also found in Twilight Town alongside Cypher and his group. Vivi is the second struggle match that Roxas fights, during which he is being imitated by nobodies. Vivi is also one of the 7 Wonders training in the tunnel to Sunset Terrace, flexing his immense black mage magic. Vivi really doesn't have too much to do with the game despite being one of the best Final Fantasy characters in the entire anthology, with a story that would fit Roxas' themes very well, one about finding your true self and overcoming your fears of who you are. Unfortunately, I don't think we're too likely to see Vivi again in a Kingdom Hearts game in the future, so we'll just have to make do with what little Final Fantasy IX content we have. Immediately following Vivi in the Struggle Tournament, and one again acting as the ambassador for his particular game, the legendary gambler Setzer from Final Fantasy VI. There's even less to say about Setzer than there was for Vivi. He's a gambler and a struggle legend. He'll go to absolutely any extent to win and to make sure his reputation isn't damaged, including bribing the competition. I guess that isn't frowned upon in Simulation Town. I think the most interesting thing about Setzer here is that he looks more like Seymour from Final Fantasy X got a makeover than he does look like himself. Come on, seriously? Look at that. And to finish off the speed round, we save the best for last, Sir Auron. Auron appears in the underworld of Kingdom Hearts 2, something that, if you've played Final Fantasy X, you realize is incredibly fitting for his character. Auron is possibly the single most badass Final Fantasy character in Kingdom Hearts, and they even gave this man one-liners.
I am the Lord of the Dead!
No wonder no one wants to die.
His limit with Sora is the iconic Bushido that he uses in the Source game, and his character as a stoic, unbreaking, determined soul to keep pushing forward for the greater good is something that transfers to this world perfectly. Without Auron, I don't think anyone would have a problem saying that Kingdom Hearts 2 Olympus is a mid-tier world at best, but given his inclusion as a party member, and the clear heart that they put into his character is a shining example of everything that Kingdom Hearts set out to do when they created an original world with crossover characters. In my opinion, having Auron come back would break the impact of his inclusion, so I'm very glad that we got him when we did, and I would not have a problem with him staying confined to Kingdom Hearts 2 for good. And yet, after all that, there's still one more thing that we need to talk about. Yozora. Currently one of the biggest mysteries in the Kingdom Hearts franchise, up there with the identity of the Master of Masters, and if Sora's dinner is still waiting for him at home. Now, I'm not bringing some convoluted theory into this video with how Yozora is a shoo-in for everything Nomura didn't get to do with Versus 13, but I definitely do want to talk about some of the connections between Yozora and his world, as we know them right now, and Noctis and the world of Final Fantasy 15. First off, we need to talk about the secret ending of Kingdom Hearts 3. Not even with the Remind DLC. You know, the one when Sora wakes up in what we all thought was Shibuya of The World Ends With You fame, but it ends up being a setup revealing Yozora's future involvement in the series while a badass rendition of Another Side plays. But after that ends, we hear this. Sound familiar? Because it should. It's the same opening chord as Somnus, which is Final Fantasy XV's main theme, and then it changes up ever so slightly because, while based on the same character and world, Yozora is inherently different than Noctis and not the same character, which I think is an important distinction to make. We get more connections between Yozora and Noctis during the Remind DLC after his boss fight. This scene is not a reference to Noctis as we know him, it's actually a callback to the reveal trailer of Final Fantasy Versus 13, in which we see Noctis in the same position as Yozora is here, riding in his car. The reason that this isn't a reference to Final Fantasy XV Noctis is because during the development of that game, Noctis' character went through a rewrite. Originally, he was ruthless and a much darker character than the goofball he was in Final Fantasy XV. The implication here is that Yozora is meant to be a Kingdom Hearts equivalent of the Final Fantasy Versus 13 version of Noctis, someone who's a dark and determined character and will always do whatever's necessary to complete his goal. In a way, he's both a parallel and a foil to Sora. Of course, all of this could turn out to be completely wrong when the game comes out. Remember, this is not a theory, this is just me diving slightly too deep into a 20-year-old children's game that I love slightly too much. And with that, we're finished. I decided to try something here and not script the ending. And I know that might sound weird, but let's just give it a shot. So, first off, I want to thank everybody who's watching this video, because this is actually my first video, and I'm super happy. I don't know how it's going to turn out, because I haven't edited it yet. So it could end up being complete shit. And if it is, well, you can only go up from here. But aside from that, I want to give a huge thank you to everyone throwing the March Caprice event. If you didn't know and you're just here by sheer luck, March Caprice is an event that is thrown by Kingdom Hearts fans for Kingdom Hearts fans. So everyone who wants to sign up can, and we can all get together to make this community a thing and show our support for the series that we all love. And I am super grateful to have this opportunity to be able to do this. I've actually wanted to make content for a long time, and I've never really had a proper driving motivation, but this was just, it sealed the deal for me. And I'm very happy that this whole thing was put on. So I'd like to thank everybody who organizes March Caprice, and I hope I did not bring too much shame to the event. Thank you so much. Of course, if you would like to see more of me, which for some reason, I do stream on Twitch on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays at 4:00 p.m. Eastern Time. If you'd like to show up and show your support, I would be super grateful. Thank you so much. I have a second channel where all my Twitch VODs go. You can go and check that out if you'd like to, test the waters before you show up. But no pressure, really. I would just like to thank you for showing up to this event, because it really means a lot to me. So thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a good day. Drink water.